Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're plunging headfirst into one of the most polarizing and genuinely significant debates in modern scholarship. What are the canonical Gospels? I mean, for centuries, millennia even, they've often been seen as sacred biographies, rooted in the memories of those who were actually there, who walked alongside historical Jesus. But, well, is that really the whole story? The core question we're grappling with today, and look, it's one that might really challenge some of your preconceptions, is this. Are these texts historical memories? Are they earnest attempts to record a life as it was lived, as it was experienced by people? Or are they maybe something else? Stylized fictions, perhaps, mythic creations crafted deliberately to mirror ancient hero tales, theological legends, designed more to persuade you than to, precisely document what happened. It's a truly fascinating and, frankly, pretty provocative question. So, our mission on this deep dive is to explore a really powerful theory that's gained, significant traction in academic circles lately. It's called mythic historiography.
Now, this concept, championed by scholars like Richard C. Miller, M. David Litwa, and Dennis R. MacDonald, argues that the Gospels are not historical accounts, not in any meaningful sense that we recognize today anyway. Instead, they propose these texts are actually theological fables, cleverly, skillfully wrapped in the sort of veneer of historical writing. Think of it like theology deliberately disguised as biography. Now, you can instantly grasp the profound challenge these theories pose, right? I mean, if they're right, it fundamentally undermines the integrity of the Gospels as historical sources. It effectively recasts them as religious fiction. Now, maybe sophisticated fiction, maybe inspiring fiction, but fiction nonetheless. But don't worry, because our aim in this deep dive is also to present a sustained, evidence-based rebuttal to this very thesis. We'll be drawing on the extensive and pretty compelling work of scholars like Craig S. Keener, Richard Bauckham, and Mark Goodacre. They argue, quite persuasively, I think, that the Gospels are actually best understood as ancient biographies, what the Greeks called bioi.
Texts deeply grounded in real oral traditions and shaped by rigorous, structured memory practices that were actually well understood in the ancient world. And look, this isn't just some dusty academic debate happening off in an ivory tower that only scholars can appreciate. For you, our listener, this is really about understanding how we approach ancient texts in general. It's about how we learn to distinguish fact from fiction in a world that's just absolutely flooded with information, right? And how we can truly appreciate the nuances of historical transmission, especially when we're dealing with texts that have shaped so much of Western thought for millennia. So get ready for some serious aha moments that will hopefully illuminate not just the ancient world, but also these documents that underpin so much of our cultural and religious understanding. Unpacking the mythic historiography theory, what are they claiming? Okay, let's unpack this compelling theory then. To really understand the rebuttal to this mythic historiography model, we first need to get crystal clear on what it actually asserts, because it's subtle, but it's an incredibly powerful argument.
Suggesting that the Gospels are not sincere attempts at historical documentation at all. Not really. Instead, proponents claim they are sophisticated literary fictions, cleverly constructed maybe to mimic the form and the tone of historical writing. The core claim here, the real heart of it, is that the evangelists, the guys who wrote the Gospels, weren't primarily interested in preserving accurate memory. Their ultimate goal, according to this theory, was to create theology, but to do it while wearing the costume of history.
That's exactly right. That's the jumping off point for this whole school of thought. Richard C. Miller, for instance, he's a key figure here. His work, Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity, really lays out a central part of the argument. His main point is that the gospel narratives, and he focuses particularly on the intensely debated resurrection accounts, were composed using stylistic and rhetorical conventions that were really common in the popular Hellenistic prose fiction of that time. He believes the gospel writers employed something he terms mimetic realism.
Okay, mimetic realism. That sounds pretty academic. Can you break that down for us? What exactly does that mean in this context?
It's a great question, and it's really crucial to grasp this. Mimetic realism is essentially a literary technique. It's designed to fabricate accounts that feel utterly persuasive, that seem historically plausible, even if, they aren't strictly factual in our sense. Think of it like a really skilled illusionist. They create an experience that feels real, right? It fools your senses, but ultimately it's still an illusion. Miller draws parallels here to works like Philostratus's The Life of Apollonius of Tyana. This was a hugely influential ancient text recounting the life of this Neo-Pythagorean philosopher Apollonius. Now, Philostratus's work, it contains fantastical elements, definitely miracles, divine encounters, that kind of thing, but it's presented in a biographical format. It has that veneer of historicity. Miller suggests the Gospels operate in a very similar way, and Miller is quite blunt about it. He states pretty directly in his analysis, the Gospels are a literary illusion of historicity, not historiography in any meaningful sense. What he's getting at is that the Gospels were crafted to look historical, to give the impression of historical truth, but their real purpose. Not documenting events as they factually happened. Instead, his method is rooted deeply in genre analysis. He argues that by adopting these narrative conventions, these tricks of the trade, if you like, found in fictional epics and the biographies of so-called divine men, the Gospels were purposefully designed to inspire belief. The goal was rhetorical. It was persuasion through familiarity, making the stories resonate with existing literary forms that audiences already recognized as compelling, rather than documentation through, verifiable facts. And this raises a really profound question for us. If Miller is right, how should an ancient reader have actually received these texts? Were they supposed to be fooled by this illusion? Or were they sort of in on it, understanding it as a kind of theological fiction?
So it's less about what actually happened and much more about what you should believe, presented using familiar, maybe even comforting literary forms. It's a powerful idea.
Exactly. And M. David Litwa, he builds on this. In his book, How the Gospels Became History, he takes a slightly more theological angle, you could say. He proposes that early Christians actively engaged in what he calls historicizing myth. Basically, they used various literary techniques to make divine events, things that might otherwise be understood as purely mythical or symbolic, appear to have actually occurred in a specific time and place. In this view, maybe Jesus himself wasn't a complete invention, but his story. It was consciously transformed, reshaped to resemble the lives of the gods or other divine figures from ancient cultures, figures who also had miraculous births, divine powers, extraordinary deaths, that sort of narrative pattern. Litwa puts it very powerfully, and this really sums up his view. Myth is not antithetical to history and antiquity. Rather, myth often became history through narrative. Now, this is absolutely crucial to his argument. He's suggesting that in the ancient mind, the strict categories we use today, myth over here, history over there, clearly separated. They weren't so rigid. For Litwa, mythic historiography is this hybrid genre. It blends theological imagination with historical form, and the truth being conveyed. It's more about meaning, spiritual insight, belief, than it is about a precise, factual recounting of what literally happened. This definitely presents a significant challenge to anyone who reads the Gospels as, straightforward historical narratives in a modern sense.
Right, that reframes our whole understanding of truth in these ancient texts. It suggests it might be more flexible, more about meaning than strict fact than we might assume. Okay, and then we have Dennis R. MacDonald. He seems to take this whole idea to its most, ambitious extreme.
He certainly does. Dennis R. MacDonald, he probably offers the boldest assertion within this whole school of thought. In his work, particularly the Homeric epics and the Gospel of Mark, he introduces this theory of mimesis criticism. Mimesis just means imitation. He posits that the Gospel of Mark, which, is generally considered the earliest gospel, was directly and intentionally modeled after Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And we're not just talking about subtle influence here. He identifies what he claims are specific, deliberate narrative parallels between Jesus' life and the adventures of Homeric heroes, especially Odysseus. For instance, he compares Jesus calming the sea in Mark chapter 4 to Odysseus surviving a great storm at sea. He sees Jesus' exorcism of Legion, remember, where the demons are cast into pigs? He sees that as a deliberate echo of chaotic Homeric battle scenes. And he even suggests Jesus walking on water in Mark chapter 6 is basically an imitation of divine epiphany stories you find in Homer, where gods suddenly appear on the water. MacDonald sums up his view with this pretty striking claim. Mark's gospel is a transvaluation of the Homeric epic in which Jesus replaces Odysseus as the divinely favored hero. He thinks the author of Mark was this incredibly clever literary artist, consciously adapting these revered mythic archetypes to elevate Jesus, to make him into a new kind of Homeric hero for a new audience. Now, while this idea certainly has, a compelling literary appeal and it's gained some traction in academic circles for its sheer imagination, it has also sparked intense controversy. And the criticism often centers on what scholars describe as its methodologically loose comparisons and a significant lack of consistent literary controls. There's a sense he might be seeing parallels where they aren't necessarily intended. The really profound question then becomes, what are the implications if a foundational religious text like Mark is essentially, as MacDonald puts it, a transvaluation of Homer? Does that fundamentally change its nature, its claim to historical truth? Does it change it entirely?
Wow, that's a powerful and really thought-provoking question. It absolutely sets the stage for our deeper dive here. So just to summarize then, this entire mythic historiography model, as articulated by these scholars, Miller, Litwa, MacDonald, it really seems to rest on four key assumptions. First, it assumes that ancient authors and their audiences kind of blurred the lines between fiction and history. Maybe they didn't distinguish them as sharply as we try to today. Second,
It claims the Gospels actually look more like Greco-Roman mythic literature than they do factual historiography or biography. Third, it posits that early Christian writers cared way more about theology and inspiring belief than about preserving accurate, verifiable memory of Jesus. And finally, the fourth assumption is that the literary parallels they spot, especially those supposed links to Homer, are clear indicators of creative composition, deliberate adaptation, rather than just reflecting existing traditions or, shared cultural tropes that were just floating around back then. So what does this all mean for you if this theory holds true? Well, it fundamentally reframes the Gospels completely. Instead of seeing them as historical documents that are, yes, infused with theological meaning, these proponents treat them as theology that is quite literally wearing the costume of history. This is where it gets really interesting, because this perspective directly challenges the very historical foundation of the Christian tradition itself. It suggests its core narratives are maybe more akin to inspiring fables than they are to verifiable historical accounts. It makes you ask, okay, what am I actually reading here? 2. The Gospels as ancient biographies, bios, a rebuttal to the genre claim. Okay, so the mythic historiography thesis makes this really strong, almost genre-defining claim, right? Saying the Gospels were never really meant to be historical. They're arguing for this hybrid category, mythic historiography. But, is that truly accurate? Is that the best way to categorize these specific texts? This is exactly where the powerful work of scholars like Craig S. Keener becomes incredibly important. He argues quite forcefully that the Gospels, far from being these mythic fictions, actually align much more closely with a distinct and well-understood genre of Greco-Roman writing known as bios.
That's the absolute crux of the counterargument. And to really get this rebuttal, we first need to define what bios actually was in the ancient world. Because it wasn't biography in our modern sense, exhaustively footnoted, aiming for pure objectivity, academic style. Not quite. Instead, bios was a genre of literature. It was dedicated to recounting the lives of notable individuals, people like philosophers, generals, rulers, sages, even poets sometimes. Think of Plutarch's famous parallel lives, where he compares figures like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar to draw out moral lessons. Or maybe Suetonius' The 12 Caesars, which chronicles the lives of Roman emperors, mixing historical facts with, frankly, some pretty scandalous anecdotes. Even Xenophon's Memorabilia, which records the sayings and deeds of Socrates. These weren't, dry academic histories, no. But they were absolutely works that preserved recognizable historical memory. Often, they had significant moral, philosophical, or cultural aims woven in. Now, Keener meticulously details the criteria that typically defined a bios. They usually focused intensely on the subject's character and actions. They often included anecdotes and key speeches that were passed down through memory. Their structure tended to be more topical than strictly chronological, meaning they might jump around in time a bit to illustrate a particular character trait or a key teaching, and a really central element was moral exemplarity, presenting the subject's life as something to be admired, maybe emulated, or at least learned from. The crucial point here, as Keener argues, is that the Gospels meet all of these criteria. They center entirely on one single figure, Jesus of Nazareth. His life is framed not as some abstract myth, but as a meaningful memory, something remembered and passed on. They narrate his deeds, his sayings, his conflicts. They name specific places, actual contemporaries, identifiable political figures like Pilate or Herod, and they culminate with his death and what his followers understood as his resurrection. Events that, yes, are profoundly theological, but they're narrated with concrete historical details, timing, locations, named witnesses, not just mythic abstraction.
So the argument is that the Gospels, despite their unique theological content, essentially fit the ancient world's template for a biography, a bios. It's a really powerful counterargument to the genre claim they're making. But hang on, what about all the supernatural stuff? Critics often jump on the miracles, the divine beings, the extraordinary events in the Gospels and say, see, that's myth, just like Greek gods and heroes. How do Keener and others handle that?
You've hit on a really vital point there, because critics of the Gospels often do make that leap. They see surface similarities between Gospel stories and Hellenistic myths, things like, divine men, miraculous healings, other supernatural acts, and they immediately say, aha, the genre must be myth. No. But this is exactly where Keener and other scholars offer a critical counterargument. They highlight a major anachronism, a sort of modern bias in how we often read these ancient texts. They explain that the mere presence of supernatural elements does not automatically relegate a text to the category of myth in the ancient world. It just doesn't work that way. Biographies of actual historical figures in antiquity frequently included miracles, divine associations, or omens without being considered purely mythical by their original audiences. Think about Philostratus' Life of Apollonius of Tyana again. We mentioned it earlier. It recounts numerous visions resurrections, healings, even raising someone from the dead, all attributed to Apollonius. Yet Philostratus clearly presents him as a historical teacher. He has a known birth, a death, an ethical life that's meant to be emulated. Apollonius isn't treated like Zeus. Similarly, Suetonius, in the 12 Caesars, describes a whole load of omens, divine interventions, miraculous signs surrounding the Roman Caesars, but no serious classical scholar reduces Suetonius's work to pure myth just because of these supernatural elements. Keener cautions specifically against these anachronistic assumptions. He states, and this is really important, biographies in antiquity often involve theological interpretation of a life without abandoning historical intent. This is a crucial distinction for understanding ancient texts. The presence of the divine didn't automatically cancel out the historical grounding. In many cases, it actually served to emphasize it. It suggested the subject was exceptionally important, perhaps divinely favored, maybe even a divine agent acting in history. It was part of how the ancients understood and presented great, significant lives.
That really flips the script on how we perceive miracles in ancient texts, doesn't it? So a miracle doesn't automatically mean fiction. Wow, that's a huge takeaway. Okay, what about the time frame then? Critics of the Gospels often assume they were written much, much later, giving myths plenty of time to grow and distort things.
Another absolutely crucial point in seeing the Gospels as bios is this concept of living memory and their chronological proximity to Jesus. Keener powerfully argues that the Gospels were written well within the living memory of Jesus himself. This is a critical distinction. Most ancient biographies, by contrast, were composed decades or sometimes even centuries after their subjects had died. They had to rely on traditions that had accumulated over long periods. But with the Gospels, it's different. The earliest one, Mark, is typically dated by most scholars to within about 30 to 40 years of Jesus' death. Matthew and Luke follow relatively closely, maybe within 40 to 60 years. John, perhaps the latest, is still generally placed within 60 to 70 years. Now, this places the Gospels squarely within the plausible window for preserving eyewitness memory, especially when you consider the oral culture of the time, where teachings were rigorously memorized, communally recited, and carefully passed down. As Keener notes, in antiquity, oral memory was a crucial bridge between historical events and written biography. Just imagine stories about a really famous, controversial figure from, say, 30 or 40 years ago today. Many people who knew them directly, or who knew people who knew them, would still be alive and could speak to the accuracy of the stories being told. This direct chronological proximity, combined with the vibrant oral culture, severely weakens the claim that the Gospels were just literary constructs invented whole cloth from mythic ideas. Instead, it strongly suggests their purpose was preservation of memory, not purely imaginative invention.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. If people who had actually seen or heard Jesus or knew his immediate followers were still around, it would be much, much harder to just invent stories out of thin air and have them accepted. Okay, finally, what about the formal features? Like how the Gospels actually begin. Sometimes people argue they lack those formal historical prologues you might see in, say, Thucydides or Herodotus.
That's a fair observation from a modern perspective, definitely. However, this argument tends to overlook the common conventions of the bio genre itself. Ancient biographies often began quite abruptly, just jumping right into the action or setting the scene quickly. Mark's opening, for example, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It perfectly fits this buyer's convention. It's much like how Plutarch might begin describing a hero's youth or their first great deed without a long formal preamble about his historical methods. Now, Luke's gospel is the exception here. It does begin with a preface, but what's remarkable is how explicitly historiographic it sounds, how concerned with sources and accuracy it is. Luke states, and this is worth hearing precisely, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." I mean, listen to that language. It's an unambiguous claim to orderly investigation. He talks about compiling accounts, interviewing sources, eyewitnesses, following things closely, writing an orderly account, providing certainty. This is a methodological self-awareness that would be entirely foreign to a purely mythic text, but perfectly at home in a serious biographical endeavor that's seeking to convey truth based on research.
Okay, well, so when we connect all these dots, the fit with the Greco-Roman bios genre, the proper understanding of supernatural elements in ancient texts, the close chronological proximity to Jesus, and even the stylistic choices in their openings, especially Luke's, the argument becomes quite compelling, doesn't it? The Gospels genuinely seem to conform to the form and function of Greco-Roman bios. They were written within the memory span of their subjects, they contain named individuals and specific geography that can be checked, and they offer moral and theological interpretations without apparently abandoning their fundamental historical claims. This fundamentally challenges the mythic historiography theory's core genre claims. It suggests they might have simply miscategorized the text from the start. 3. The power of memory. Eyewitnesses and oral tradition. Now, if the mythic historiography theory is correct, it also really hinges on this idea that the gospel writers weren't actually concerned with preserving eyewitness memory. That wasn't their goal. Instead, they were primarily shaping theological narratives, almost inventing them from scratch, maybe using bits and pieces of tradition, but mostly creating. But what does the evidence truly say about the deeply oral nature of ancient cultures and the absolutely critical role of eyewitnesses in that specific context? Were these just anonymous stories floating around, changing with every telling, or was it something more grounded, more controlled?
This is precisely where Richard Bauckham's really groundbreaking work, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, becomes so important. It fundamentally challenges that common assumption, that picture of the Gospels just evolving anonymously within these vague, uncontrolled oral traditions where anything could happen. His core claim is that many, maybe even most, of the stories we find in the Gospels can be directly traced back to specific individuals, and their names actually appear in the text precisely because they functioned as the guarantors of that memory. They were the living sources, the people who could vouch for or attest to the events being recounted. Think about it for a second. Why would a narrator include seemingly minor details, like specifically naming Bartimaeus, the blind man healed by Jesus near Jericho in Mark 10, or the mention of Rufus and Alexander, identified as the sons of Simon of Cyrene, the man who carried Jesus' cross in Mark 15? I mean, these aren't figures crucial to the overall plot development, but Bauckham argues these names are absolutely not incidental or just decorative color. He states quite clearly, and I find this utterly persuasive, the presence of names in gospel narratives reflects the use of eyewitnesses whose authority was still available when the traditions were first transmitted. He shows how this practice aligns perfectly with conventions found in both Greco-Roman bios literature and also in Jewish historiography, where ancient writers commonly cited living figures whose memories served to stabilize and validate the transmission of important events. This indicates the evangelists didn't just randomly stumble upon these details. No, they deliberately embedded memory-living, verifiable testimony into the very structure, the fabric of their narrative.
So these names are almost like subtle footnotes, pointing back to people who could verify the story, like ancient fact-checkers, in a way. That's a really powerful point about named witnesses. But beyond specific names, how did oral tradition itself function? Did it preserve history accurately, or did it naturally tend to twist things into myth over time?
Right, because the mythicist view often fundamentally misunderstands, or frankly, underestimates how oral societies actually preserved and transmitted vital information. You have to remember, in first century Palestine, literacy rates were quite limited. Writing materials like papyrus were scarce and expensive. So oral tradition wasn't just casual storytelling around a campfire. No, it was the primary, rigorous method of education, of religious formation, and crucially, of historical preservation. Imagine a culture where key stories, important teachings, legal traditions were memorized and recited with incredible precision. Greg Keener, in his massive work, Christobiography, details how these oral cultures operated with what he calls gist accuracy. Now, what does that mean? It means that while the exact wording of a story or a teaching might vary slightly from one telling to another, think about how you might tell a story about your grandfather. The core facts remain the same, but your phrasing changes each time. The core content, the essential meaning, and the key factual details were preserved with remarkable consistency. And this wasn't accidental. It wasn't just luck. This consistency was achieved through constant repetition, through communal recitation, like in synagogues or early Christian gatherings, and importantly, through a process of communal correction. If someone deviated too far from what was collectively remembered, the community, especially those elders who had heard the original words or witnessed the events, could and absolutely would correct them. Keener emphasizes this strongly, saying, even in oral tradition, there were norms of fidelity. Teachers were expected to transmit accurately, and communities could correct errors by appealing to those who had heard the original words. This communal verification process acted as an incredibly powerful brake, a control mechanism against uncontrolled myth-making or arbitrary invention. It's highly improbable that the gospel accounts, if they were widely seen as blatant fabrications or wild distortions, could have survived and gained the traction they did during the lifetime of Jesus' direct followers. Those followers would have known firsthand if the stories were being invented or twisted beyond recognition.
Okay, so it's like a dynamic living memory, but one with built-in safeguards controlled by the community and those closest to the events. And what about the timing again? Does that chronological proximity, being written within 30, 70 years, really make that much of a difference?
Absolutely, it makes a huge difference. The mythicist model often implicitly or explicitly assumes a large gap, maybe centuries, between the events of Jesus' life and the actual writing of the Gospels. This assumed gap allows ample time, in their view, for legends to develop, for myths to accrete and eventually overshadow any historical fact, much like the slow buildup of myth around very distant ancient heroes like Hercules or Romulus. However, this assumption of a long gap is increasingly challenged by mainstream scholarship on gospel dating. As we said, Mark, typically seen as the earliest, is often dated by scholars to within 30 to 40 years of Jesus' death, maybe around 65-70 AD. Matthew and Luke followed relatively shortly after, perhaps within 10-20 years of Mark, maybe in the 80s AD. And John, perhaps the latest, is still generally placed within 60 to 70 years of the events, maybe around 90-100 AD. Now, this dating places the gospel squarely within what memory studies calls the window of living memory. In ancient cultures, especially Jewish culture, which highly revered elders and first-hand testimony, memories could be vividly and reliably passed down for many decades. This is significant. Bauckham points out that this kind of chronological proximity is entirely consistent with, or even closer than, many other ancient biographies that were written much later than the Gospels, but are still considered historically reliable sources by classical historians today. So the idea that such a relatively short period, just 1 or 2 generations, allowed for the complete fabrication of a central mythic figure who was then accepted by communities that included people who knew him or his immediate followers, well, that narrative simply doesn't hold water against the evidence we have about oral culture, memory practices, and the actual dating of the texts.
Right. All of this evidence, when you put it together, it really points towards a serious and deliberate effort to preserve history, not to consciously invent it. The Gospels don't look like the products of anonymous myth-making communities where wild stories could just flourish unchecked over centuries. Instead, they seem to reflect these deeply embedded structures of eyewitness testimony, operating within a vibrant, controlled oral tradition, shaped by collective memory, stabilized by communal practices, and crucially, tied to identifiable individuals. This paints a very, very different picture from the mythic historiography model. 4. Beyond Homer. Misreading ancient literary models. Okay, so one of the most imaginative and frankly one of the most appealing arguments put forth by mythic historiography theory comes from its literary claims. We're talking, of course, about Dennis R. MacDonald's idea that the Gospels, particularly Mark, were directly modeled after Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. I mean, it's a very clever, very intriguing idea on the surface, but is this comparison genuinely robust? Or is it, as some critics strongly suggest, maybe a case of seeing what you want to see, finding connections that aren't really there?
That's the absolute critical question, isn't it? And it speaks directly to the very method of literary analysis itself. Dennis R. MacDonald, particularly in his book The Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark, presents a very detailed, very intricate case for what he calls literary mimesis. Again, mimesis just means imitation. He suggests that the author of Mark deliberately, consciously echoed Homeric scenes, motifs, even structures, to craft a theological narrative that would effectively position Jesus as a kind of new Hellenistic heroic figure, perhaps analogous to Odysseus. He highlights what he claims are specific structural echoes and a pervasive pattern of allusion running through Mark's gospel. For example, as we touched on, he compares Jesus calming the sea in Mark 4, where Jesus literally rebukes the storm, to Odysseus surviving that fierce storm at sea and being rescued by divine intervention in the Odyssey. He sees the exorcism of the Gerasene demoniac legion, where Jesus casts a multitude of demons into a herd of pigs that then rust tragically into the sea, as a direct nod to the chaos and destruction depicted in Homeric battle scenes. And he even suggests Jesus walking on the water in Mark 6 is an imitation of those divine epiphany stories you find in Homer, where gods suddenly appear miraculously walking on the waves. MacDonald meticulously maps out dozens of these supposed parallels between Mark and Homer. And he concludes with this really bold statement. Mark's gospel is a transvaluation of the Homeric epic in which Jesus replaces Odysseus as the divinely favored hero. He genuinely believes the author of Mark was exercising immense literary ingenuity, consciously adapting these revered, culturally powerful mythic archetypes to elevate Jesus, to present him as a new kind of Homeric hero, perhaps for a mixed Jewish and Gentile audience familiar with those epics. Now, while this thesis certainly demonstrates considerable literary imagination, and it has definitely garnered attention, it has also been met with a very strong criticism from many biblical scholars and classicists. precisely because of what these critics describe as its methodological looseness, its tendency towards a selective use of parallels, picking ones that fit and maybe ignoring ones that don't. And crucially, its significant failure to adequately account for the much stronger, much more pervasive, and frankly much more obvious Jewish roots of the Gospels.
Methodological looseness. That sounds like polite academic language for reaching a bit too far. Can you elaborate on why scholars like, say, Mark Goodacre find MacDonald's parallels less than convincing? What's the problem with finding parallels?
That's a fair question, and it's a common criticism leveled against what the biblical scholar Samuel Sandmel famously and rather colorfully termed parallelomania. This is the tendency, sometimes seen in comparative literature or religious studies, to construct these grand, sweeping theories based on what turn out to be rather tenuous or superficial literary similarities. It's where the desire to find connections kind of overrides the need for rigorous evidence. It's like finding two completely different books from different cultures that both happen to have a character who goes on a journey or faces a big challenge, and then concluding one must have copied the other, even though journeys and challenges are pretty much universal human experiences reflected in stories everywhere. Mark Goodacre, in his critique of MacDonald's work, explains it perfectly. He says something like, "The existence of thematic or narrative parallels does not in itself demonstrate literary dependence. Common motifs across ancient literature often reflect shared cultural tropes, not direct imitation. Think about it. Storm scenes, sea voyages, confrontations with powerful, even demonic entities, journeys away from home and back again. These are ubiquitous themes across countless ancient narratives, whether they're labeled myth, history, or biography. The mere presence of these motifs in Mark doesn't automatically necessitate Homer as the direct source. In fact, many of them could much more plausibly derive directly from Jewish scriptural traditions. Think about the story of Jonah being swallowed by the great fish after a storm at sea, or Psalm 107, which explicitly describes God commanding the storm and calming the waves. Or they could simply stem from the historical memory of actual events on the Sea of Galilee, which is known for sudden, violent storms. To prove true literary dependence, one text borrowing directly from another, you really need far more than just finding similar themes. You need things like shared unique phraseology, specific structural replication that goes beyond generic patterns, or explicit references, none of which are consistently present at the level MacDonald claims for Mark and Homer.
Gotcha. So it's not enough to just see a similar theme, like a storm. You need much stronger evidence of direct, intentional borrowing, like unique wording or structure. And you mentioned the Jewish roots of the Gospels being overlooked. How does that compare to these Homeric claims? Is that a stronger connection?
This is arguably the most crucial counterargument, and frankly, it's one that the mythic historiography camp, especially those focusing on Hellenistic parallels, often seems to overlook or significantly downplay. The absolutely overwhelming literary and thematic influence of the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament on the Gospels. Many, if not most, of the so-called mythic tropes that they identify in the Gospels are in fact much better and more powerfully explained by the evangelist's deep, intimate, and constant engagement with the Hebrew prophetic and narrative traditions, not with Homeric epic. You have to remember, the writers of the Gospels were almost certainly Jewish themselves, steeped from childhood in Jewish scripture and tradition. For instance, take Jesus walking on the water in Mark 6 again. Does it necessarily evoke Homeric deities appearing on the waves? Or does it much more powerfully evoke a passage like Job 9.8, which describes God himself as the one who alone treads on the waves of the sea? That seems a much more direct and theologically resonant connection within a Jewish context. Similarly, Jesus' exorcisms and miraculous healings align far more naturally with the recorded activities of Israelite prophets like Elijah and Elisha, who, according to the Hebrew Bible, also performed spectacular healings and even raised the dead. These parallels are much closer culturally and theologically than parallels to Hellenistic miracle workers like Apollonius, and the very idea of resurrection itself. It's deeply rooted in Second Temple Jewish eschatology, the evolving Jewish understanding of the end times, divine judgment, and the eventual resurrection of the righteous dead. It's not primarily derived from Greco-Roman deification myths where heroes might ascend to become gods or achieve immortality after death. The Jewish concept was different. Craig Keener really underscores this point effectively. He states, quite clearly, the Gospel writers drew most heavily on Jewish scripture and tradition. Parallels to Greco-Roman literature are secondary and often exaggerated. This fundamental shift in identifying the primary literary context, moving from a speculative Homeric influence to a demonstrably deep Jewish framework, profoundly impacts how we should interpret these texts. It suggests the Gospels are engaged in an internal conversation with their own inherited scriptures, perhaps presenting Jesus as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies, rather than looking outwards to imitate external pagan literary models. The confusion in the mythicist approach, particularly MacDonald's, also stems partly from a fundamental genre misclassification, I think. Homeric epics are, well, epic oral poetry. They're rooted in ancient myth and legend, often performed orally over generations before being written down. The Gospels, on the other hand, are prose biographies, or bioi. They're grounded in teaching and testimony, compiled relatively quickly for specific communities, and aiming to convey both what happened in Jesus' life and what his followers believed it meant. Their fundamental purpose, their narrative tone, their overall structure, and certainly the expectations of their primary audiences are markedly different from Homeric epic. And even if we grant that some gospel content reflects a certain literary stylization, maybe shaping real events with rhetorical skill, adding some dramatic flair to make a point, this doesn't automatically imply fictional invention. Plenty of respected ancient historians like Plutarch or Tacitus frequently use dramatic flair and rhetorical devices. They put speeches in people's mouths, they highlighted dramatic moments to engage their readers and make history come alive. Yet no serious scholar suggests they simply invented their main subjects or their core historical narratives wholesale. The crucial distinction always is between stylistic enhancement of memory and outright fabrication of events.
Okay, so putting this section together then, the argument for Homeric imitation, while definitely imaginative, really seems to falter under close scrutiny. The parallels are often broad, maybe even contrived at times, and crucially, they tend to overlook the primary, most obvious literary framework that the evangelists were clearly operating within, their own rich Jewish tradition and the Hebrew scriptures. The Gospels, viewed this way, are a distinct genre, driven by remembered events, interpreted through the lens of Scripture, and fueled by profound conviction, not primarily by a desire to mimic or transvaluate Homeric poetry. This really shifts our understanding of their underlying literary DNA, doesn't it? The ancient authors knew the difference, genre awareness in antiquity. A truly troubling implication, almost a side effect of the mythic historiography model, is this underlying idea that ancient audiences simply couldn't tell the difference, that they couldn't distinguish between history and myth, between fact and fiction. It assumes a rather surprising lack of sophistication in the ancient world, almost a kind of intellectual naivete. But, did they really not know the difference? Did the Greeks and Romans, and indeed the Jews of that era, genuinely lack the critical capacity to distinguish between, say, an entertaining story meant purely for diversion and an account that claimed to be factual?
That's a critical point to challenge, absolutely. And the evidence strongly suggests the answer is a resounding no. It's demonstrably false, or at least a vast oversimplification, to claim that classical historians and their audiences had no awareness of genre boundaries or no concern whatsoever for truthful historical representation. Far from it. We have numerous examples of ancient authors who were not only acutely aware of these distinctions, but took great pains to articulate their commitment to historical truth as they understood it. Take Thucydides, for instance, writing his History of the Peloponnesian War way back in the 5th century BC. He famously stressed the vital importance of eyewitness testimony and what he called plausible reconstruction of speeches based on known facts. He explicitly stated his methodological approach, seeking to record events as exactly as possible, based both on his own presence and on interrogating others with the utmost thoroughness. He consciously rejected the myths and poetic embellishments favored by earlier writers like Homer in favor of rigorous investigation. Polybius, another highly respected Greek historian writing a few centuries later, was even more direct, almost polemical about it. He explicitly condemned historical works that blurred history with fable or legend. He warned strongly against confusing political myths or entertaining tales with actual causation in understanding historical events. Polybius famously stated, and this is a clear declaration of historical intent, "No one should write history as fiction. The task of history is to instruct and persuade through true events." That quote perfectly captures the classical ideal of history. It was meant for instruction, and it had to be built on verifiable, true events. Similarly, Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the late 1st century AD, right around the time some Gospels were likely circulating, clearly delineated in his works like Antiquities of the Jews between what he considered hearsay or tradition and what he regarded as documented fact. He often corrects or clarifies earlier accounts based on better sources or what he deems more reliable testimony. Now, these authors, while obviously not operating with modern scientific or empirical methods, absolutely valued truth, memory, and the integrity of their sources within their own cultural context. And importantly, ancient readers, particularly educated ones, understood these genre signals. They learned to interpret texts differently based on whether they were presented as history, historia, biography, bios, epic poetry, philosophical dialogue, or mythos.
Okay, so it's clear these respected ancient historians, the big names, had a strong sense of historical integrity, or at least claimed to. How does this awareness of genre and truth-telling apply to the gospel writers themselves? Did they share this kind of concern, or were they operating in a completely different bubble?
Given this broader intellectual context, the strong argument made by scholars like Keener and Bauckham is that the gospel writers operated within this ancient framework of genre awareness, not somehow magically outside of it. While they certainly infused their narratives with profound theological meaning and clearly believed in divine intervention in Jesus' life, they deliberately chose to write in the genre of biography, bios. And as we've discussed, bios in the ancient world, while flexible, held a fundamental claim to historical memory, not to pure legend or abstract myth. As Craig Keener argues, gospel writers, like biographers of their day, believed they were preserving and transmitting history, even if shaped by theological memory and interpretation. They understood the conventions of their craft, the expectations associated with the bios genre, and consider Luke's prologue again, back in Luke 1:1-4. It is just strikingly historiographical in its language and its stated intent. It echoes the prefaces written by other serious ancient historians. Luke speaks as many others who have undertaken to compile a narrative. He states that he himself, having followed all things closely for some time past, decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. This isn't the language of someone weaving a myth or a fable. This is explicit methodological self-awareness. It's a claim to careful investigation, to checking sources, eyewitnesses, and to orderly presentation, all aiming for certainty. These are hallmarks of ancient historians and biographers, and they would be utterly foreign, completely out of place in a purely mythic text. Luke is essentially saying, look, I've done my homework, I've checked my sources carefully, and I'm giving you a reliable account based on that research. And this directly challenges Richard Miller's contention that the Gospels are merely literary illusions of history, based on what we might call a genre collapse theory, this idea that in the ancient world, myth and history were functionally indistinct, or that authors just didn't care about the difference, or that audiences couldn't tell anyway. That generalization is simply not supported by the broader textual evidence from antiquity. On the contrary, as we've seen, many Greco-Roman authors took great pains to distinguish what they considered reliable sources and factual accounts from speculative myths or fanciful tales. Josephus, again, constantly evaluates his sources, sometimes dismissing earlier accounts as fables, while upholding others as historically verifiable based on documents or testimony. So, to claim that the gospel authors deliberately wrote myth disguised as history and that their audiences would have been none the wiser makes two pretty significant and, I think, historically unwarranted assumptions. First, it assumes a kind of literary cynicism on the part of the writers that they were intentionally trying to deceive their readers. Second, it assumes a profound literary naivete on the part of the readers that they were easily fooled by genre conventions. Both of these assumptions are quite difficult to sustain given the general sophistication we see in ancient literary culture and historical writing.
Right, so they weren't necessarily trying to trick anyone, and their audience probably wasn't easily tricked either. What within the Gospels themselves, besides Luke's prologue, points towards this historical intention? Are there other internal cues that suggest they meant to be read as history or biography?
Absolutely. The Gospels themselves, all four of them really, contain numerous features that actively signal a historical intention. These are characteristics that are simply unnecessary, even counterproductive, if the sole aim was to create pure myth or timeless fiction. They include, consistently, specific names of real, verifiable historical people. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea who authorized Jesus' crucifixion, a figure known from Roman sources and archaeology. Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest during that period, also historically attested. Herod Antipas, the Tetrarch of Galilee, another well-known figure. These aren't generic evil kings or wise priests of myth. They use precise, or at least plausible, chronological markers, like dating the start of John the Baptist's ministry in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Luke 3:1. They detail specific, verifiable geographical settings: Galilee, Capernaum, Jerusalem, Bethany, the Sea of Tiberias, the Jordan River. These are real places you could visit then, and can still visit now, and they exhibit a strong sense of cultural realism. They portray debates over intricate points of Sabbath law, specific temple customs, Jewish purification rituals, tax collection procedures under Roman rule, and various social interactions that accurately reflect the complex realities of first-century Jewish life under Roman provincial administration. Now, none of these features, the specific names, the dates, the places, the cultural details, are strictly necessary for a purely mythic narrative or theological fiction designed solely to convey timeless truths. You don't need to name the governor or specify the town for a simple fable. They are, however, absolutely standard elements in ancient historiography and biography. Their consistent presence strongly suggests the gospel writers intended their accounts to be read as rooted in real-world events that happened in specific times and places, not as free-floating allegorical fables. And finally, I think we also have to consider the weight of literary responsibility that even theological writers seem to feel within the early Christian movement. If you look at the earliest Christian texts we have, the epistles, particularly those attributed to the Apostle Paul, which predate the written Gospels, they consistently refer to real events, named individuals, and specific community contexts as historical facts, not as symbols. The resurrection, for example, is treated by Paul not as some beautiful symbolic abstraction or a purely spiritual metaphor for new life, but as a witnessed historical occurrence that grounds everything else. Paul explicitly states in 1 Corinthians 15.5-6, and this is a direct appeal to verifiable public fact. He appeared to Cephas Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Now think about that statement. That isn't the language of myth-making. This is a bold, public appeal to living, verifiable testimony. He is effectively saying, don't just take my word for it. Go ask them. Hundreds of people saw him. Many are still around. Such a statement only makes sense, it only has rhetorical force within a genre and cultural framework that genuinely values eyewitness history and the possibility of historical verification, not one aimed solely at creating mythic effect or symbolic representation.
Wow. Okay, bringing all of that together then, the mythic historiography thesis really seems to depend on a fundamental misunderstanding, maybe even an underestimation, of ancient genre consciousness. It looks like the Gospels are not literary illusions designed to fool people. They seem to operate squarely within a culture that understood and distinguished between different kinds of writing, between entertainment and testimony, between symbol and memory. The evangelists, particularly Luke, but arguably all of them, clearly intended to document the life of Jesus as it was remembered by those who knew him or their immediate successors, not simply to fabricate some inspiring myth purely for theological effect. It really seems the ancients were far more sophisticated readers and writers than the mythic historiography theory sometimes gives them credit for. Outro. So we've really come full circle in this deep dive, haven't we? We've unpacked the core arguments behind this influential mythic historiography theory, which, as we've seen, posits that the Gospels are essentially theological fictions cleverly disguised as history.
But we've also presented a sustained rebuttal, showing you that the bulk of the evidence seems to point in a very different direction. We've seen compelling arguments that the Gospels fit squarely within the recognized ancient genre of bios, or biography, not mythic romance or Hellenistic fiction. We've explored how they appear grounded in robust oral traditions and supported by claims of eyewitness testimony, featuring named witnesses and possessing a chronological proximity to the events that's remarkably close by ancient standards. We also dissected the literary claims, demonstrating that their primary literary models seem overwhelmingly to be the Hebrew scriptures and Jewish tradition, not Homeric epics. And finally, we've shown that ancient audiences and authors were quite sophisticated. They absolutely understood the difference between history and fiction, and the Gospels employ clear historical markers, names, places, dates, to signal their intent as accounts rooted in real events. So our fundamental conclusion based on this line of scholarship is that the Gospels are not best understood as literary illusions. They are perhaps better understood as remembered truth, the kind of truth that inevitably lives in that complex tension between verifiable fact and profound meaning, between historical event and theological interpretation.
Yeah, and to reinforce that point, just think about the practicalities again. The Gospels were likely written too early, too close to the actual events that they describe, and too publicly, circulating within communities that definitely included living eyewitnesses or people who knew them directly, to be easily dismissed as mere mythic inventions crafted long after the fact. The mythicists really struggle to provide convincing explanations for several key features. Why are specific, sometimes minor, named witnesses included within the text if they weren't sources? Why are hostile figures like Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas specifically named and placed in history, rather than being hidden behind vague, generic archetypes like the evil governor or the corrupt priest? Why were the very first resurrection witnesses reported as women, a detail that, frankly, no fabricator in that patriarchal first century culture would likely have chosen if they were simply trying to create the most universally persuasive, easily accepted narrative from scratch? And why did Paul, writing even earlier than the Gospels, so boldly appeal in 1 Corinthians 15 to over 500 living witnesses for the resurrection? That's an open invitation to verify the historical claim he's making, not the act of someone spinning a myth. And then you have to consider the powerful implication of martyrdom that followed for so many early Christians in subsequent decades and centuries. People went to their deaths, often enduring horrific persecution under Roman authorities, not, it seems, for a metaphor they understood, not for an inspiring story they knew to be merely fable, but for what they profoundly believed to be the truth, for a verifiable reality they felt they had experienced or had heard directly from those who had. As the Apostle Peter is quoted saying in that later text, 2 Peter 1:16, and I find this particularly resonant here, "For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." Based on this evidence, the Gospels are not, therefore, best labeled literary allusions of history. They seem better understood, perhaps, as history narrated in a theological key, carrying powerful testimony, not simply myth.
This deep dive, then, really reveals that to reduce the Gospels to mere myth, however sophisticated, is arguably to ignore the very specific literary and historical traditions from which they actually arose. And perhaps more importantly, it overlooks the profound human urgency and the depth of conviction that seems to have driven their creation and preservation. So here's a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. What does it mean for you to engage with a text that, while clearly infused with profound theological meaning and interpretation, appears to have been crafted by memory keepers rather than myth makers? Consider how understanding this ancient context, the role of bios, eyewitness testimony, oral tradition, and Jewish scriptural grounding, how that might profoundly change how you approach not only these specific religious texts, but truly any historical account from antiquity that is shaped by profound human experience, collective memory, and interpretive conviction.